Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Low Spec Labs. Before we get started, I would like to stop and say thank you to everyone who has tuned into the channel so far. Thank you to everyone who has liked, commented, and subscribed. If you are new to the channel, please go ahead and hit the subscribe button in order to keep up with my up-and-coming IT and automotive content. Otherwise, let's get started. We're talking about Chapter 21 of the RHCSA exam book, Configuring Apache. Before we get started with this series on Apache, we should talk about Apache, what it is, and its history. Apache is an open source web server created in 1995 by Rob McCool. What does Rob look like? Well, he looks like exactly the kind of person who would make an open source web server. His brain is so large, his hair got terrified and decided to run away. At one point in time, Apache ran over 70% of the internet. Nowadays, that number is more around a rough 30, which is still a significant chunk. So if you're going to be a Linux admin, you should probably learn how to manage Apache because eventually you'll be running across a server running it. RHCSA comes with Apache baked in. So normally you won't have to install it, but just in case you actually do have to install it, I'm going to teach you how to do that. Let's go ahead and get started. The actual process of installing Apache is relatively straightforward. We first spin up our virtual machine, and then we do a quick DNF install. So in order to install Apache, it's as simple as DNF install httpd. It would also help if you're an admin. And then we click yes, yes. And there we go. That's all it takes to get Apache installed on your web server if you're using RHCL. Very simple, right? So how do you actually manage Apache server? Let's find out together. Like most services on Linux, Apache is managed using config files. Where are these config files? The first is at etc httpd conf. That is actually where your main Apache config file is. The second location you need to know to manage Apache is etc httpd conf.d. This is a directory that's going to hold the other Apache config files you might create. The third directory you need to know is etc httpd conf.modules.d. This is another directory or folder that contains the modules for Apache. So Apache is a modular file server, meaning you can add features to it. And if you wanted to add a module or feature to Apache, you would place the files to add that module inside of this folder. That's about it as far as the background information you need to know for you to configure Apache. The best way to learn how to actually configure it is to hop in and configure it. So let's pull up our virtual machine. Once we have the virtual machine pulled up, we can then begin configuring this. So let's hop in and use nano to pull up our server config. And then we do sudo because you do need to be an admin to configure Apache. Then we do nano etc httpd conf, and then we do httpd.conf. Of course, we enter our password, and there we go. This is our Apache config. So one of the options you're going to have to know is how to set server root. And what is server root? Well, the server root option in your Apache config defines where your configuration files for Apache are going to be held. So you'll notice it's in etc httpd. If we were to close this and then were to do ls/etc httpd, you'll notice all the folders we need for Apache and all the files we need for Apache are right there. If we were to want Apache to use a different folder as its root or to look for config files, we would open back up nano and we would change this entry between these two quotes. We're going to leave it the same because leaving defaults is very convenient. The next setting we need to configure our Apache server is the listen port. So for instance, right here it says listen 80. What this effectively means is that Apache web server is going to look for requests aimed at port 80 when we make a web request. So for instance, if we were to change this to 8080, we'd have to go to our website, whatever IP that is, and then type in :8080 in order to get the website to pull up. The next setting you need to know is the include conf settings. What does this setting do? Basically, because Apache is a modular file server, you need to tell Apache where to look for additional modules. Again, our conf.modules.d folder is the default folder that modules for Apache will be placed. So if you were to download modules, you'd place them in etc httpd conf.modules.d, and then all your module files are going to have to end in this .conf like extension right here. After that, you have to set your username for Apache. So on Linux servers, it is highly advised that if you're running a service, you create a user and group for that service, and you lock down permissions for that service just in case it gets compromised. In Apache, you can do this inside of a setting. So you would make a user and make a group called Apache, and then you would come in here and set the user and group to Apache. This has already been done as part of the default Apache install, so you can just leave this as stock. The next setting is perhaps one of your most important. This sets the root folder of your website. So when you create a website, there's going to be a folder, and inside of that folder is going to be an index.html that defines the start of your site. This has to do with the way websites are designed. I'm not going to go too deep into that, but you would change this directive in order to change the location that your site contents are at. So if you had one website, you would just place the contents in var www.html. If you had multiple websites, you would place them inside of subfolders inside of var www.html. So again, if you want to change your site root or the base location of your website, you would change it right here. We're almost done, boys. This is going to be a short chapter for you guys, and for me as well. So the next option inside of Apache config you need to know about is your error log. What does it do? Well, it defines where Apache is going to log any errors that users trying to access your site face. So sometimes you might have an issue with the website, and in order to troubleshoot that issue, you need to look at logs. This tells Apache where to store those logs. So let's close Nano, save our changes, and then let's do an ls-alh/etc httpd. And if we were to do that, you'll see we have a folder called logs that's actually a symbolic link to var logs httpd. So automatically Apache is storing our logs in var log httpd, and we can verify that by doing an ls-alh var log httpd, and you'll see we got to do sudo. That folder is empty because Apache web server hasn't been run yet. So we know how to install Apache, and we know what the most common configuration options are. Let's go ahead and create a sample website, and then we're going to start up the Apache service, and we'll visit that website and see what it looks like. For your website to be recognized by Apache, you need an index.html in the var www.html folder. So we can do sudo nano var www.html, then we're going to call this index.html. And then we're simply going to type in hello world. And that's it. We save and exit. And then we can do a sudo systemctl enable -- now httpd. And there we go. We've now enabled and started Apache web server. So we can verify that by doing sudo systemctl status httpd. As you can see, it's currently running. So how do we verify that site is actually working? Well, first things first, we can open up Firefox, and then if we were to go to localhost, there you go. Our website is working. It says hello world. And with that, we verified that Apache is working. And that's it for this chapter. Like I said, it is a very short chapter because it's about configuring one application. And most of that is knowing what settings to change. It's not too hard to open up a text file, change some settings. You mostly have to know what the settings are doing so you can know what changes you're making. Thank you again for tuning in to another episode of Low Spec Labs. Chapter 22 is next up, where we talk about SE Linux. Are you excited? I'm not. But you need this knowledge, so we're going to go through this together.